I invite you to turn with me to Genesis chapter 50, verses 14 through 20.
After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives."
Well, welcome to week 2 of this sermon series. We're looking at the power of one. Power of one. And how throughout history God has called individuals, men and women, to do very specific things at a very specific time. And those individuals have literally changed the world because they chose to listen to God. Last Sunday we looked at the life of Abraham, the book of Genesis, and the very pinnacle of Abraham's life when his faith was put to the test, when he was called to sacrifice his son. And this morning we're looking at one of my favorite Old Testament characters. We're looking at Joseph. Looking at Joseph. Now, somewhere on your bulletin or in your notes, I want you to write this down. I want you to write down the name Joseph, and then next to his name, I want you to write down Romans 5, 1 through 5. So Joseph, and then Romans 5, 1 through 5. So write that down now because we're going to come back to this a little bit later this morning. I always find it interesting as I'm reading through Scripture to count up how much time the writers of certain books spend on certain things. Like an example of this is in the book of Genesis. The author of Genesis spends right around 13 chapters of the book focusing directly on Abraham and Abraham's story. And the author of Genesis spends 12 chapters focusing on Joseph. Obviously, there's something very important that the author wants us to see, that the author wants us to pay attention to. Now, the story of Joseph has all the elements of like a great modern Hollywood movie. I mean, you've got hope and love, despair, hatred, envy, violence, temptation, vengeance, suffering, conquest. I mean, it's all there. It's all there in the story of Joseph. But even more than all of those things, the story of Joseph is the story of a dreamer who grew to follow God and never compromised. Now, if you want to go back and actually dig into the entire narrative of Joseph, due to our time constraints, I can only kind of give us a surface level of his story. And we could spend weeks on each of these characters individually, but if you want to dig in deeper, you can write down these passages. If you start in Genesis 37 and then skip over to chapter 39 and read all the way through chapter 50, that gives you the story of Joseph. Genesis 37 essentially to Genesis 50. Now Joseph was a son of Jacob, born when Jacob was very, very old. And Joseph was Jacob's favorite. So every parenting strategy that you've ever heard, just throwing it right out the window. Joseph was Jacob's very favorite child, and he made no qualms about it. He made it obvious in public that Joseph was Jacob's very favorite child. Now, Joseph watched his other brothers and told his father everything he saw his brothers doing. So in other words, Joseph was really just a little tattletale growing up. Every time his brothers would do something wrong or something he thought their father wouldn't like, Joseph would run back and tattletale on his brothers. So you can imagine how much his brothers liked him for that. And if that wasn't enough to get his brothers angry against him, Jacob gave Joseph a very special present for being his favorite. Fancy, colorful coat. So by now his brothers were really, really hating Joseph. And if the fancy coat wasn't enough, Joseph had dreams. And of all the things we can accuse Joseph of, being sensitive probably isn't one of those things, because as soon as he received these dreams from God, he immediately told his brothers his dreams. The first dream being that he and his brothers were out in the field and they were bundling up big things of grain, bundles of grain all throughout the field. And all of a sudden in Joseph's dream, his bundle of grain stood straight up, while his brothers' bundles of grain bowed down and worshipped his. And the second dream really wasn't much better. In his second dream, the sun, moon, and 11 stars, representing his brothers, all bowed down to worship Joseph. So you can imagine how this would have infuriated his brothers. Because now this little whippersnapper is saying that everybody else around him is going to bow down to him. Everybody else is going to be under Joseph. And even Jacob put Joseph in his place verbally. We see that account. But while Joseph's brothers became even more angry and even more full of hate, Jacob started wondering, started questioning what all this could mean, all these dreams. What could all this mean? And as the story goes, Joseph's brothers went out into the field to tend the flocks. Joseph was there with his father. And his father sent him after his brothers to check up on them once again to see if they were doing what they were supposed to. And we encounter a very interesting little passage. Joseph is on his way out to check on his brothers. But from a long way off, his brothers see Joseph coming. And they say, "Here comes that dreamer. Here comes that dreamer." And I can't help but think about the story of the father and the prodigal son. When the son is coming home and from a long way off, the father sees the son and runs to meet him. But in this story, brothers of Joseph saw him from a long way off. It's funny how love can see a long distance, but apparently so can hatred. And initially their plot was to capture Joseph and to kill him so they could be rid of this dreamer. But then they became convinced it would be enough to just throw him in a pit and take his fancy coat and send it back to their father, saying that Joseph was dead. And it just so happened that traveling merchants were coming by, and they decided they'd make a quick profit. And they sold Joseph to these merchants who were on their way to Egypt. So off goes Joseph to Egypt as a slave. And his father Jacob is left to mourn his son, thinking Joseph was dead. What will become of Joseph and his dreams? Joseph and these merchants end up in Egypt, and Joseph once again is sold, but this time to Pharaoh's captain of the guard named Potiphar. What will become of Joseph and these dreams that God had given him? But there's an interesting phrase that occurs over and over in this story of Joseph. The phrase is, and the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph. And even though Joseph was really nothing more than a slave in Potiphar's house, everything Joseph did succeeded. Absolutely everything Joseph touched worked. It succeeded. It was great. He was the best out of anyone in the household. And it didn't take long for Potiphar to realize there was something special about this Joseph. So pretty soon, Joseph was in charge of everything in Potiphar's house. Here, the captain of all the guards of Pharaoh was putting this slave named Joseph in charge of everything. Everything. And the Lord was with Joseph. But Potiphar's wife even noticed this little slave named Joseph and wanted him for herself. Now Joseph could have given in to the temptation. He could have traded the dreams that God had given him for momentary pleasures in Egypt. No one back home would have known. But how did Joseph respond? What do we see in Scripture? Many people forget about God and their successes. They get successful. It's easy to forget about God, because our successes have a way of distracting us from God if we allow ourselves to focus more on them than God. You ever do this when you were a kid? If you go out on a clear night with the moon out and the moon's full, you can actually put your thumb up to the sky. Have you ever tried this? And if you put your thumb right where the moon is and start bringing it back towards your eye, your thumb can actually eclipse the moon. You can actually get the thumb so close to your eye, you won't be able to see the moon. Now, is your thumb really bigger than the moon? Of course it's not. But when you get it right there in front of your face, to where you can't see anything else, it becomes the biggest thing in your sight. This is how distractions and the things of this world can eclipse our view of God. When we start letting the little things become the biggest thing in our life. But Joseph refused to compromise. He refused to take the cheap and easy decision. He refused to trade his God-given dreams for anything less. And his exact words to Potiphar's wife when she propositioned him are priceless. It's something that I think we all should use and own for ourselves. Joseph says, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? How could I turn my back and break my God's heart by doing what I know is wrong? How could I do such a thing?" Joseph knew what was at stake here. And if you remember the story, we could all learn a lesson from Joseph on how to deal with extreme temptation. When Potiphar's wife propositioned him over and over and over again, he didn't just hang around. He didn't fool around with the temptation. He ran. We have the record in Scripture that Joseph literally turned tail and ran out.